Greetings from South Africa. Global Vision presents the television news magazine of Southern Africa.
It doesn't exist on television, and it doesn't exist.
I would actually appeal to the world that information is there and can be found.
Because it is important that people know what is happening.
This week, South Africa Now presents these stories. Many said it would never be done. History is made as South Africa's parliament unbans the ANC and announces freedom for Mandela. But there's a lot de Klerk didn't say. We'll have the details for you.
Mr. Nelson Mandela could play an important part. The government has noted that he has declared himself to be willing to make a constructive contribution to the peaceful political process in South Africa.
But not everyone was happy. Our cameras captured the way some police were celebrating the political reforms. And in our culture segment, Mama Africa, Miriam Makeba, the songbird of freedom, the continent's best-known musical ambassador. We have another exclusive.
I cannot sing about baby, baby, I love you, when in fact we are being killed every day. That is what I've known. I've known love in a different way because even the oppressed fall in love.
All of these stories and more on South Africa Now. But first, the uncensored news with Fana, Kekana and Phillip Tomlinson.
Dumelang. Phillip Tomlinson is sitting in for Carolyn Craven. By now, almost everyone knows some of the South African news we regularly cover. The dramatic news that Nelson Mandela is to be freed, the ANC and other movements unbanned, some political exiles welcome to return, and the state of emergency partially lifted. We have in-depth coverage, beginning with State President de Klerk's announcement during the opening of Parliament, February 2nd. Nadja Smith has this report.
I wish to put it plainly that the government has taken a firm decision to release Mr. Mandela unconditionally. I'm serious about bringing this matter to finality without delay. The government will take a decision soon on the date of his release.
De Klerk is expected to announce the date of Mandela's release on February 12th. In the New York Times, ANC leader Thabo Mbeki questioned de Klerk's sincerity, referring to a speech given by the state president to police officers, in which de Klerk said, "Without resolution of the issues, there could be an Armageddon, in which 5 million could be killed." Mbeki said that Mandela will only leave prison if real negotiations get started, and Winnie Mandela says her husband is holding out for a complete lifting of the state of emergency. Mbeki told us 2 weeks ago about Mandela's position.
We'd have to see whether they end state of emergency, whether they do release political prisoners, apart from Nelson Mandela, other political prisoners, whether they allow organizations such as the ANC to operate openly, legally, publicly. If those things happened, then you could say it's an indication that the South African regime is prepared, is getting ready to enter into a process of negotiations. And I'm sure as part of that sort of process, Nelson Mandela will be released.
De Klerk's historic speech went further than most observers expected, a serious response to calls for a new climate conducive to negotiations. He also legalized the Pan Africanist Congress and the South African Communist Party, freed many but not all political detainees and prisoners, lifting some state of emergency provisions, including restrictions on 374 activists. ANC President Oliver Tambo, now recuperating from a stroke in Stockholm. ANC leader Thabo Mbeki. Zwelakhe Sisulu, the New Nation editor who has been restricted, and even Joe Slovo, the communist leader who is considered a most wanted man for leading the MK, the ANC's military wing. The Pan Africanist Congress, which rejects negotiations, was also unbanned. We spoke to Count Pietersen, Deputy Chief Representative of the PAC, for a reaction.
We welcome the unbanning of our organization and other organizations. In the first place, they should never have been proscribed. But the focus of our struggle was never to realize the unbanning of the PAC or any other organization, but national liberation and self-determination for the oppressed and exploited Azanian masses.
In the streets of South Africa, there was jubilation, spontaneous marches, and optimistic statements.
I found it exhilarating, quite astounding that we seem to be at the dawn of the new South Africa for which so many people have striven, have paid heavy prices.
Archbishop Tutu and Winnie Mandela were among those celebrating in Cape Town, perhaps a preview of a new South Africa, but the old South Africa was out in force on the same day in Johannesburg, where a spontaneous outburst of pro-ANC sentiment was greeted with clubs, snarling dogs, and tear gas. Here's what our home video camera recorded. First, the people, and now the police. One eyewitness gave us this account.
What actually happened was that as people were celebrating in the streets peacefully, the police moved in and they started shooting tear gas, and some were carrying like these long rifles, which means that they actually intended using rubber bullets. But we didn't get to know about any injuries that were occurred yesterday.
One footnote about media coverage. President de Klerk has now lifted some press restrictions, but not those limiting TV coverage of so-called unrests. Let's go to the videotape. You'll notice a TV crew videotaping. Now, with the police on hand, they've turned their camera off. One of the networks, NBC, did cover this incident, but one video crew not hassled was this one. They work for the police. Most of the press coverage stressed how far South Africa has come. Here's the Johannesburg Star, New York Newsday, and the Washington Post. But what may have not been fully covered is what President de Klerk left undone. We spoke with Dr. Charles Vicencio of the University of Cape Town.
There are certain laws that constitute the very pillars of apartheid that are still there. I refer, for example, to group areas. The security legislation, that legislation which was in place before the state of emergency, that legislation which in fact constitutes a kind of permanent state of emergency, detention without trial. Section 29 of the Security Act. What is going to happen with those pieces of legislation?
Many other observers noted also that de Klerk has abandoned his commitment to the concept of group rights. Not one person, one vote. Under a group rights formula, they say, South Africa would have apartheid with another name.
Democracy, it seems to me, is one person, one vote. And all the forces of liberation inside South Africa have said one person, one vote in a unitary state. We are not there yet.
Why has de Klerk taken the new positions he enunciated? Part of the reason may be international pressure. That's what Archbishop Tutu told us.
All the things that are happening aren't happening because we've suddenly got people who feel good about things. They're doing things because they must do them.
The South African government was under considerable external pressure to pull something pretty dramatic out of the hat with the parliamentary speech. The British and the Americans weren't going to hold the line on further sanctions unless something fairly significant was announced. Then secondly, of course, there's been this massive upsurge of organized protest, and the marches and the demonstrations, and the crowds have certainly exceeded anything that's happened in South Africa in the last couple of decades, just in terms of scale. And they do point to the fact that the repression of the emergency just hasn't had the effect that the soldiers and the bureaucrats thought that it would. The mass democratic movement has very much survived repression and is still obviously a very pertinent force.
There was protest as well as jubilation on the day of the Klerk's parliamentary address. In 10 cities worldwide, anti-apartheid demonstrators urged that there be no let-up of pressure on South Africa and that Mandela be freed immediately.
One people, united, will never be defeated.
In Chicago, pickets were at the Federal Building. In Los Angeles, there was a press conference of community leaders. And in New York, outside the South African Consulate, hundreds rallied. Jesse Jackson made a surprise appearance on the eve of his trip to South Africa, where his life has been threatened by extremists.
We are hopeful that we see laws or regulations being relaxed, but the pressure must remain applied until there is in fact a new South Africa, a democratic South Africa, where all the people across lines of race, sex, and religion are free.
The ANC's United Nations representative was cautiously optimistic.
Still having the state of emergency in South Africa, which has brought a whole lot of misery on the people of South Africa. It has given the South African police and army the right to lord it over the South African people. It has given them protection against any kind of prosecution for all the atrocities that have been perpetrating against the people of South Africa. The state of emergency is still in place, and therefore we cannot accept that de Klerk has done enough. We think that there's a lot more that de Klerk needs to do.
And the protesters told us they will be back if South Africa reneges on its promise to free Mandela and other political prisoners. For South Africa now, this is Phillip Tomlinson reporting. That's also the theme of this week's commentary by Randall Robinson of TransAfrica, who led a march the same day outside the South African Embassy in Washington.
South African State President F.W. de Klerk's announcement of the unbanning of the ANC and the release of Nelson Mandela comes against a background that media coverage tends to gloss over. First, Mandela himself has shown his leadership qualities by negotiating the terms of his own release. He has steadfastly refused to leave prison unless it was done unconditionally. He has also demanded that negotiations be started to begin the transition to a post-apartheid society. The white government has agreed to begin the process of working out a new constitution. Secondly, it was a combination of internal and international pressure that forced the government to act. South Africa's economy is hurting. Sanctions have worked to limit growth and new investment, both badly needed. The economic cost of political repression has been driven home. And ironically, if Western governments, including our own, weaken or lift sanctions now, they will strengthen the hand of white domination. Third, the unbanning of the ANC and other political groups only legalizes actions that the movement have already taken through courageous resistance and defiance campaigns. The regime has lost its will to enforce a system that it knows is unworkable. We can now expect violent right-wing extremists to try to destabilize the situation in South Africa. We will now hear a chorus of liberal opinion urging our government to stop the pressure and in essence side with de Klerk in his negotiations with the ANC. Now more than ever, it is important for our media to keep its focus on South Africa and not just treat the story as if it's over once Mandela walks through those prison doors. He has shown that he is already free. It is now his country's turn. That's my view. I'd be interested in yours. I'm Randall Robinson of TransAfrica for South Africa Now.
In other news, Namibia has now set a date for the country's long fought for independence. Here's Joseph Diescho.
I'm Joseph Diescho with Namibia Watch. Independence from South Africa is coming sooner than expected. March 21st, 1990 is set for Namibia's independence, 11 days ahead of the April 1st target date. This after the country's Constituent Assembly reached an agreement on a final draft of the Constitution after weeks of deliberation and hotly contested debates. And to the north of Namibia in Angola, intense fighting is reported with the Angolan government claiming that its military offensive against the US-backed UNITA rebels is gaining ground, with 500 of Jonas Savimbi's men reported dead. South Africa now has learned that the US may be mounting a new diplomatic initiative in Angola. We'll have more details soon.
You're watching South Africa Now, the television news magazine that goes behind the headlines.
With the world's attention on South Africa's parliament, we have a report on one of its best-known former members, Helen Suzman, who says that the real negotiations now will require serious compromises by all parties. Suzman appears cautious but optimistic, and for many years she was a lonely voice for change, although her politics today are far to the right of the anti-apartheid movement.
I was subjected to a good deal of hostility, and certainly there was no one with whom I would care to sit down and have a meal with in Parliament among the colleagues, and it was fairly lonely, but it was also very busy. I was so preoccupied with keeping up with the workload that really I didn't have time to feel sorry for myself or lonely or any of those emotions which might have undermined the real determination I had to get on with the job.
When Suzman entered Parliament in 1953, getting on with the job meant fighting for the repeal of past laws limiting the movement of blacks within the country.
I got so incensed, and this is before the National Party came into power, mark you, at the restrictions that were placed on black people who wanted to move from the rural areas to the urban areas, the so-called pass laws, that I thought would be quite a good and practical thing to get into a political party and see if one could use influence through the party to get the law changed. And that's really what got me going.
33 years later, in 1986, Suzman reached what she calls the pinnacle of her career.
I think it was the day the pass laws and the influx control laws were repealed. That to me was a high. I was absolutely delighted. I felt one of the most oppressive laws had been, in fact, removed from the statute book, because just to give you the figure of the people who had been arrested in the 2 years prior to the repeal of the laws, in reply to a question I put in Parliament, it was over 500,000 people.
Since she retired, Suzman's Progressive Federal Party has merged with other liberal factions in Parliament to form the new Democratic Party, which won 33 seats in recent elections. Critics say increasing support for the party's platform indicates a change in white South African thinking.
And right through the election campaign, they made clear that the policy was one man, one vote on a common roll, and that all apartheid legislation had to be repealed, and there should be a Bill of Rights and freedom of speech and the rule of law. So we'll wait and see how they behave in Parliament. My BDI will certainly be upon them for what it's worth.
Suzman's support of South Africa's black leaders is well known. She frequently visits Nelson Mandela in prison, and recently freed ANC leader Walter Sisulu thanked her for working toward his release. Despite these ties with South Africa's black leadership, Suzman remains out of step due to her position on sanctions.
They do disagree with me, and they disagree with me firstly because they believe, I think mistakenly, that sanctions are going to do the trick, and do the trick quickly. In other words, a quick fix, sanctions imposed, the dismantling of apartheid, the demise of the regime, and its substitution by a black majority government. I have no such illusions.
Suzman remains alienated on this position away from home as well. She was confronted at a recent visit to Ohio University.
That sanctions not only hurt black people, but more importantly, they hurt white people.
Sure, but
and they're the ones with the power. And it matters whether they are hurting or not, that the sanctions are, in fact, pushed. We're not talking about hurting black people. Obviously, none of us want to hurt the majority, but they are already hurting. And I think that if this university would be more fair, they would have had someone like Bishop Tutu here instead of you, who represent the people of South Africa. It's not fair.
The American Anti-Apartheid Comprehensive Sanctions Act has been on your statute book since November 1986. Nothing has changed since then in South Africa.
And while black South Africans feel change cannot come soon enough, Suzman feels they should at least acknowledge recent reforms that have occurred, such as the desegregation of beaches and the release of ANC leaders.
I wish they'd had a more positive response, instead of which they said, well, that's just crumbs. And of course the government then has the response, whatever we do is not enough. They're always moving the goalposts. And of course, the goalposts will go on being removed until black people have the vote.
This is Phil Bertelsen reporting.
Coming up next on South Africa Now, Miriam Makeba.
Molweni mawethu, ndinguMiriam Zenzile kaMakeba Qasho. Nijonge kule mini South Africa Now.
We have a treat for you in this week's culture segment, the music and magic of Miriam Makeba, sometimes called Mama Africa. She has been on the world's musical stage since the 50s, spreading the sound and style of the freedom struggle. She recently sat down with South Africa Now. The voice is loved, respected, and as full of life's history as the rhythms themselves. Called the Empress of African Song, meet Miriam Makeba. Born in Johannesburg in the depression of the 1930s, Miriam Makeba honed her talents with local bands. In 1955, her appearance in the film Come Back Africa brought her international attention and invitations for appearances worldwide. That's how she came to America.
When I was here, I was being interviewed all the time. I was the first African artist to come here, especially from South Africa. And I was different. I sang different songs. And people had a lot of interest in me. And they asked me how South Africa was. And I told them just like it was, how we live and the whole thing. And I was not very popular with the South African government for that.
In 1963, the ANC asked Miriam Makeba to address the United Nations on the life of artists in South Africa. Soon afterwards, she was banned from returning home. Miriam Makeba became a political exile.
I draw my strength from the everyday lives of my people, my environment. I cannot sing about baby, baby, I love you, when in fact we are being killed every day. That is what I've known. I've known love in a different way because even the oppressed fall in love.
With her new album, Welela, it seems that nothing much has changed in the last 27 years. Upon its release, 4 of the songs were banned.
The title song, Welela, was written by my own grandson, who is 21. He was born on the 4th of April, the same day Dr. King died in 1968. And now he's written a song for his grandmother, and I'm very happy that my own grandchild can participate in my career. No one really knows the pain of exile until you are in exile, because people will be nice to you. I've had very nice reception everywhere I go. But there are certain times in certain moments where some people will make you know that you are with them, but not of them. Music is an integral part of our everyday life. We don't go to a concert to listen to music. We have music all the time, everywhere. When a child is born, we sing. When a child is circumcised, we sing. When a child gets married, we sing. When somebody dies, we sing and we dance. So that music is really intertwined with our everyday life. We tell stories through song. We tell history through song. Something happens today in South Africa, tomorrow there are 10 songs expressing what happened in 10 different ways. We sing when we're happy, we sing when we're sad. To that wonderful, wonderful mother. I always believe, I think, and I believe I will go home someday. When, I can't say, but I somehow deep down I feel and I believe that I will go back home.
That's our program this week. We are pleased the networks are back in South Africa. And as events unfold, we will continue to bring you a variety of perspectives that you won't see elsewhere. We are grateful to our viewers who continue to respond to our financial crisis. For more information on the issues we cover, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to South Africa Now, P.O. Box 1907, Canal Street Station, New York, New York 10013. South Africa Now is produced by Global Vision on a non-profit basis in association with the Africa Fund, a tax-exempt organization providing assistance and relief to victims of apartheid. Thank you for joining us. Next week, you'll meet the Afrikaner writer, Rian Malan, author of My Traitor's Heart. We leave you now with more of the music of Miriam Makeba. On behalf of everyone at South Africa Now, I'm Fana Kekana. See you next week.
South Africa Now is also supported by public television viewers like you.